and now we have two speakers before lunch. This guy, he's at all the things, all over, everywhere, all over the world. He's the CEO of 3C Consulting and the managing director of Multiverse Capital, and he's going to talk, and we're all going to learn stuff, and it's going to be great. And I'm sure he's standing back there. Let's hear it for Nic Easley.
Pues bueno, ojalá que este sirve, pero él me va a ayudar allá afuera. So we'll hopefully that'll work out well. Yeah, my Spanish not that great. Saber y ganar. Hoy vamos a hablar de muchas cosas, no solamente de España, pero también muchas cosas internacionales que se pueden ayudar. But at the same time, Spain's relevance for how it's going to play into international policies and its production standards, from what you're doing in Almeria and so many other places, from your club models. The world has a lot that it could learn from Spain as well, so today we'll go through some of that. Just always a really important disclaimer for me before I do a presentation. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an investment banker, I do fund management, I'm not soliciting securities. Very possible I'll offend you, I swear often, but other than Ukraine, I haven't been wrong in quite a while about something, so let's just say I'm not guessing. Next slide, please. So I've been in this space for about 16 years, legal cannabis, from being in farm country Wisconsin as a small kid, not speaking Spanish obviously, being a Romance language linguist for the military, es por eso hablo español, no como ustedes, pero más como gente en el sur. And I'll just say right now, like, Catalan, so challenging, so many different words. I've been feeling ignorant for days here. But after the military, I went to Colorado in 2006 as a medical patient. We didn't have commercial medical cannabis yet. It was still like caregivers, you couldn't really grow it, sell it, kind of like nonprofits, kind of like your clubs here. But then in Colorado in 2008, we had the first commercial medical cannabis program. And that's where you could have a license as a company, and you could sell it and grow it and actually profit. Even though California started earlier in 1996 with that, with the Compassionate Care Act, they still didn't have a legal commercial medical cannabis until much, much later. Colorado, we were also the first adult use market in 2014. So having worked through those markets, now close to 40 states, we've worked in more countries than states, surprisingly, even though the United States is where everything's happening. So next slide, please. What a world it's been. This little map went from one little thing to so many other new countries. Now, in the United States, cannabis is federally illegal, even though we're going to be doing close to probably $30 billion in revenue this year, in 2022. All of these other countries, it's legal from a medical standpoint, or Canada from a recreational standpoint, or Uruguay, or soon to be Germany or Switzerland with their kind of weird pilot program, or kind of like Amsterdam with the weed experiment. We're starting to see this change happen. In the United States, it was slow, and then it got a lot faster. And internationally, we're close to just about $1 billion in revenue for medical sales, because international is not like my arm hurts. A doctor has to give you a bona fide prescription for medicine, for flour or oil. And only in Canada or in the United States legally are we actually making products like vape cartridges, edibles, cookies, beverages. This is all psychoactive THC side. Everything international medical is always about the API, the flour or the oil, and it has to be compounded by a pharmacist. So don't bring me an investment deck later to make weed chocolates in Germany next year, because medicinal weed chocolates, we're a little ways away from that, but eventually those things are coming. Yes, sir. Oh, nice. Dominion. A ver, si funciona. Perfecto. Okay. One thing that's very important, though, when you look at this map, as an investor, as someone who works in the industry, I look at this map, and then I always cross-reference it on this map. What are the PICS countries? These are countries that have the same international drug development standards as the United States, as the European Union. So if you're making a drug product, a medicines, or a standardized API and doing clinical trials, you'd better be doing it in one of these countries, because your drug development process, your clinical trials, and all of the APIs and intellectual properties you're developing from those places, if it's not in one of these, it doesn't get into the big places. So you might have a grow license in Colombia, but if you're not doing your clinicals, let's say with Argentina or in another place, those standardized drugs are not going to get to market. So you're like, okay, where is it legal? where are the PIGS countries? And then I'm also like, where is the best climate? And then you start to see certain places in Asia that are really critical, Mexico really good, Portugal and Spain. Desafortunadamente Colombia y todos esos países allá no están por la lista. Pero ojalá que Argentina lo cambie porque por fin podríamos tener algo allá. So PIGS countries are really important, especially if you're thinking international medical for like pharmaceutical development, which is different than compassionate use, which is how we're currently legalized today. Clinical research, clinical trials, just to do a high level on them, they're very fucking expensive, and they're more complicated than you could possibly imagine unless that's what you do. So if you're thinking about doing clinical trials and making APIs, know that going through this process could be over $562 million on average to get a standardized API approved through phase 4. So it's great, we do need to study Parkinson's and all of these other things with cannabis, but it's expensive to make those standardized drugs. That's why you see GW Pharmaceutical have such a huge valuation, because they went through that process. Not saying those are good medicines, or quality, or affordable, or ethical, but it's just part of the normal game. So I've talked about this for the last few years. It's super important. It's still not happening as fast as I would like, but in December of the previous year, 2020, when the UN rescheduled cannabis, this was one of the biggest milestones for international medical cannabis development, and actually changing like international cannabis law and drug policy. But by changing it and saying that it's no longer the same as heroin and that it has medicinal value, it just needs more study, that should have been the gateway to just open the entire floodgates into countries now like changing their Controlled Substances Act, countries coming up with programs, or more specifically, International Narcotics Control Board stated that everyone who is a member of the single convention, which is pretty much everybody, needed to amend their Controlled Substances Act and make some sort of national or federal office of medical cannabis. None of these countries are doing that yet. There are 29 countries, though, that are starting to change these things, especially one big one, Germany right close, by them amending, potentially, their Controlled Substances Act, or leaving the single convention and changing something and then coming back into it. Like, what a world of change that would be. So this is super critical, and it was like the number one of like 3 major things that need to happen. I was just a little wrong because it's happening a little slower. I thought we would have jumped on it, but coronavirus and now Ukraine, we're kind of busy with a lot of other things going on at the moment. Another huge thing for European countries, novel foods did happen. Many times in the past, people said it wasn't going to happen. It would never be scheduled as a novel food, CBD, no, no, no. Well, goodness with Brexit, that like any of the United Kingdom countries are not really subject to that. But this is the case, and as of like this morning, there's only 2 companies that have the license for contract manufacturing for novel foods in Europe. And if they did it for CBD, they're probably going to do it for other cannabinoids. What about CBN? What about CBG? What about all of them, most likely? We'll see. Another huge thing I mentioned is there's all these hundreds of cannabinoids that we're very, like just in the beginning of studying many of these. Some we haven't even known about, others we've known about for years, but have no idea how they interact. In the United States, Delta-8, which under the Farm Bill and hemp production, you can grow a lot of hemp, and isolate and extract, just Delta-8. If you've done Delta-8 just by itself, you may or may not have a pleasant experience. But the DEA is pretty much on the verge of making this a Controlled 1 substance, even though it's derived from a plant that can be legally produced. So even if you think about some of these other, like, oh, it's kind of not like spice or anything naughty like that, but like, it's this other way I can make profit. Just remember like CBD in 2014, you're like, we're gonna be billionaires. And then now this giant $2.2 billion CBD market that's happened, sadly, probably less than 10% of products have COAs or bona fide, are not just snake oil or tested and safe, which is so sad, because it's a great cannabinoid, just people are fucking it up. Same thing, Delta-8, great cannabinoid, people just fucking it up and taking advantage of the rules. So if you're on that path, just know major things are happening, and being considered like heroin or cocaine, not gonna be good for an investment strategy. Doesn't really work well for anybody, other than the United States right now currently. Now in the United States, like federally illegal, remember, completely illegal to do everything that we do in America. We follow state law. Each state's kind of like its own little country, like they legalize medical or recreational, choose how to do licensing, and each and every state has done it differently. But from 1996 until today, we have 46 states that have some sort of medical cannabis law. We still got a few holdouts. But then during coronavirus, we added 9 more states for adult use. Like, we have 19 adult use states. They're not all currently doing sales yet. But that's like our Californias, Oregons, Washingtons, Nevadas, Arizonas, New Mexicos, Colorados, Michigans, Maines, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Virginia, Connecticut. Am I missing one? I think I hit them all. Darn too close. But when you think about how much revenue is possible in tracking this and logging this, Canada thought they were going to take over the world, had the first legal program other than Uruguay, but as a big nation, we're going to set the stage and the standards for everything that's going to happen internationally for how adult use cannabis happens. It's not the Amsterdam like cannabis clubs or the Spain ones. This is a good model, but not where it's taxed and logged and tracked and taxes are paid. Here, it's just starting. But the clubs I've gone into here recently, like, we have social clubs in the United States where you can buy and consume cannabis on site. But they have air handling systems, massive like fire sprinkler suppression, all these different things. Some of the ones I was in, let's just say security, odor, safety, quality, you know, kind of lacking. There's some great quality too, but you know, God bless it, people have access to medicine. But really watch what's happening in the United States here. And when you see this patchwork of, you know, California started it, but Colorado started the commercial side. And as it started to go around the country, we've got, I mean, Senate Bill 711 in North Carolina about to pass. South Carolina just pushed a big bill forward. Georgia gave 6 licenses, about to give 16 more. And in some of these places, you have one of 6 licenses for 12 million people. You think Colorado, 1,300 cultivator licenses for 6 million people, and we cannot grow cannabis in Colorado and take it to other states. So we can never cross state lines with things. So all the cannabis I grow in one state and process, I have to sell in that state. And of course, I, you know, would never want our consumers to take that to another state. But as this is really starting to get bigger, most of the states haven't even really come up with huge programs yet or know how to deal with the revenue, or they didn't give enough licenses early. So it's not just evolving quickly. It's like, oh, $150 billion of sales go from the illicit market to the legal market overnight. It takes time to do that transition. But when you think about the wholesale cost of, let's say, 1 kilo in California legal of cannabis, you might be $3,000, let's say at a, you know, a good standpoint. But then on an illicit market, 1,200, 1,000, because they don't have to pay taxes, healthcare, testing, packaging, all of these other laws. But there's more licenses and the price starts to come down. Consumers continue to switch over to that. And we're also doing so many new sorts of products that, of that close to like $28 billion that's going to happen this year, beverages, edibles, concentrates, cartridges. It's not just weed and flower anymore. I mean, that's less than 50% of all of the SKU sales in the United States. So even if you just said 25 billion in, let's say, like legal cannabis last year sales, that means like 12.5 billion was not weed. It was standard consumer packaged goods. So how often do you think of like a brand in the store of a product versus an actual product itself, the tomato versus a ketchup or a salsa? The same thing's happening here, and that trend will continue internationally. So the brands that are starting to jump internationally, even non-psychoactive and getting brand recognition and exposure, really lucrative investment targets as well. We've got more states coming online, like I mentioned, North Carolina. There were states that passed and legalized, and then like their Supreme Courts wouldn't allow them to actually do their programs. You know, Connecticut right now, closer to New York City than Massachusetts, where adult use is, or way up in the north in Maine. But they're doing weird lottery systems to get these licenses. And if you know how to stack those lotteries, you can get more chances that you're gonna win. But then these social equity programs, which really have started in the United States, where, you know, minorities, people of lower income, or had cannabis crimes in the past, can get licenses in some states easier than others. But I've had states where I had a client lose a license a decade ago for like having a gram of weed record for having a little possession. But now that would maybe get you a license before a multi-billion-dollar public company. So navigating social equity, not only is it the right thing to do, like to increase like female ownership, minority ownership in the cannabis industry, but to also think that every state and new place that we legalize, there's less people going to jail for like small amounts of cannabis. And last year there was over 1 million cannabis arrests, of which over 80% are to minorities. It's not representative. So as we legalize cannabis in the US, we're also doing like massive social justice. It's the same thing that's gonna happen throughout Europe. And maybe not from past cannabis crimes, but just know like that angle, it's not only the right thing to do, but it could give you a unique edge in helping to get into the market earlier. I make fun of Canada a lot, I have always, and I've not ever been wrong about Canada. So when you see, even this was the shot from 2020, like of how like everyone's going public, let's raise capital there, it's easier than raising private capital, and then you have these big market troughs, and then now when you think about this morning when I did this, if there's a laser on this, I'm gonna love it. Oh, fuck yes. Okay. So this was coronavirus March, that was March 18th through 2022. Like we made more money that day than probably in the history of the world. And then, you know, spikes happened, Biden, shit's not gonna get crazy. And then just this shit for the last year. February was the only time we had a positive month in cannabis stocks this last year. Great for deducting losses, but I know companies that should be at $25 a share that are at like $6 a share. And it's not correctly valued. So I sadly have like bought there. I keep buying in these like troughs, but it's not the bottom yet. So this is a very, you know, I hate Canadian public companies. There's great US companies there to get capital into America, but it's almost that time to really start thinking about some of those companies because they're super undervalued. Some of them are doing like $400 million in revenue a quarter, and they have massive positions in multiple states. So they talk about those MSOs, those multi-state operators that work in many states. They have different companies in each state in order to do that. And it's not like a cross-border thing that's happening yet. But just know that like when we see the numbers that are happening on revenue and projections, we're a quarter or two away from people actually taking some cannabis companies seriously. And I'm not talking about like some cannabis companies. I mean, this was from like 3 years ago, and it's perfect for this week because they just bought their competitor, if you know about the Hexo, couple $100 million toxic debt thing. So it's like this keeps happening. The Canadians, they can only do about $5-6 billion in legal sales for adult use, which they're not even close to yet. But they can't produce at a cost that's low cost, high quality, and export that to the rest of the world. They were the first ones to have the chance to do that, but they have failed at doing it successfully. And as you know, in Spain, some of those big dogs came over here, spent 80, 100 million euros trying to get licenses in Spain for medical production, or in Portugal, in Isle of Man, all the, you know, North Macedonia, you name it, they were there, so were we. But then that same license that cost 80 million euros sold for 3.1 million euros a couple years later. So it's like every license is not valuable. It's about the time that license is there, who can they export to, what's the quality of that? It's not just like raise a bunch of money and go public. Also, like all these greenhouses that have gotten shut down there compared to like Colombian operations and others, we're not shutting greenhouses and production in Colombia. We don't have a huge market yet. But like all these big markets continue to sell things and close these things down, and then a lot of times they're being taken apart, shipped to America, and reconstructed to actually do it there. So it's been a very big challenge for foreign nationals, people that are not US residents, to invest into cannabis in the United States. If you're from London, you got the Home Office and this division of like Foreign Crimes Act and some BS, you could even get in trouble for investing into real estate in America that's for a cannabis company. So you gotta be really careful. Like international investors, we have funds to help navigate that, but if you're trying to invest into some of these things, even just last week, the Biden administration saying like, yo, not a good idea to buy cannabis stocks if you're gonna work for us. Like, that was one of those dips last week. It was not a pretty thing. It's the same thing. So if you're an investor, you're international, there's tons of great international things to do. There's tons of great US things to do, but hands-on cannabis companies, you gotta be really careful about how you do that, because seizing assets, being prevented at borders can be major problems. Just jumping into Europe quick, donde estamos por fin, we've seen major changes, but not major revenues. Main reason being international. In order for a prescription to happen, you need a doctor to actually write that and have education. Think that smoking or using a plant's gonna be better than anything on the market. There might not be cost, insurance, all these issues to navigate. That's why Germany's, I don't want to say set a good standard, or model, but they've done the most out of any country so far in getting patients access to medicine. Now, there's a lot of ways around that system. We do, the price, you guys remember when it was like 26, 30 euros a gram? We're down now 7 to maybe 15 euros a gram?
10 to 20.
10 to 20? So, I mean, prices are coming down, they've got access to medicine. How many times do they buy it once for a better can jar and then just put whatever in it? You know, it's a unique program, but there's not a Walgreens or a CVS pharmacy chain. You've got thousands of these small little pharmacies that you're doing 2 kilos to this one, 3 kilos to that one. Majorly hard market to navigate as an international producer. Even though everyone talks about selling to Germany and importing there and being the biggest, but as we all know, that's not so much the case. You know, here in Spain, I'm a big fan of the climate here for just agricultural production. I always think, where can I produce this cheaply, environmentally responsible, and undercut competitors at like the highest quality standards? So being PICS country, Spain is good for that. Your climate's good, not super expensive to do business. I mean, Portugal and Spain are the best climates in Europe where there's political climate and agricultural climate that kind of overlap each other. And then also your laws are finally starting to catch up. So I do think that not only for your domestic in-country you've got opportunities, but also on an export standpoint, because you could produce cannabis so much cheaper than they could in Germany or in Denmark or in France, just based on farming, your agricultural knowledge, plus all of the ancestral wisdom that you have with this plant, which has allowed some of these clubs to actually happen. Clubs are pretty awesome. I highlighted gray area. It's not gray, it's pretty black and white. And it's kind of like the United States. It's not legal, it's not companies. It's kind of this allowed thing, kind of like coffee houses in the Netherlands, but then not actually happening, but it's happening. So these little gray areas, kind of like the Netherlands or here, or like weird little clubs in Switzerland that are going to be starting for their like clinical trial adult use study, which is crazy to me. But thank God these things exist, because it's actually sparked consumer culture, like genetics, breeding, so much experience with that here, and also seeing what consumers like. But also, like the other day we saw like infused Cheetos, you know, in a social club, and you're like, you would get so sued in America if you did something like that. This is a big deal for us right now. A friend of mine over there, I mean, we can all talk about this all day, but this is really important for Spain and for Europe, even though it's really shitty for Ukraine. So like, our groups have probably lost well over 10 million so far in Ukraine, just because there's massive industrial hemp applications there, cheap land, great climate, not EU taxes, insulation, textiles, protein, like all of the things industrial that we talk about hemp, this was the place to actually do it, because it's too damn expensive in Europe to even try to do this in the beginning. So a lot of investment, I know of probably 150, close to 200 million that was designated towards Ukraine that now has no home, nor does Ukraine very much. But, so if you are in industrial hemp and you are in the EU and you are producing, just know like funders are interested again in industrial stuff, because the battlefield where they were gonna be like doing all of their deployments, someone else is doing a major deployment there right now. So really got to think about that, and also like what we can do. But there was so much focus there in this last 2 weeks. I've just seen that shift to so many places in Europe. So something you could kind of think about here. This is one of the most important markets to me, but it's one of the smallest, but it's based on the climate and the cost of production. Like, did anyone have coffee this morning by chance? Maybe a couple? Yeah, like did we grow that in Spain? Probably not. Probably came from one of these places, or Africa, or places there's better climates for producing plants that are from there, the same as our plant. So anywhere near the equator is massive. I mean, Peru with a few new medical licenses have been like incredible to watch. Uruguay's medical program has blown up in opportunity zones in a good way, and they're doing major exports now. Colombia, when they changed their law to actually allow oil and flower exports, huge game changer. But it doesn't open up all the markets. It doesn't teach doctors. It doesn't get new prescriptions going. So every time, like I mean, we've gotten 5 of the ones in Colombia, and every time I look at them, I'm like, these are going to change the world if we can just hold on long enough to not go out of business in the process. It's like short-term and long-term plays, like crushing it in America with adult use revenue. International, everybody's bleeding, and that's where we need tons of capital as well. So The long term, I mean, Africa's been a challenging continent for us. I mean, I didn't get the new Nigerian kind of research play on here, but from Lesotho, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, South Africa, I mean, South Africa's program is also going to be, I think, the one that's changing that whole nation and how they're going to allow adult use and kind of really pushing to regulate it like alcohol. And when you see the prime minister come out being like, yo, we're going to make 150,000 jobs and like X amount of new revenue in a country like South Africa, like, somebody's getting reelected, or like somebody's going to take, like, there's going to be an example there. But it's also not a huge, massive export opportunity yet, just based on the standards. But the one country for medical that's important down there is South Africa, because it's the one country in the continent that's a PICS country. And the climate's pretty decent down south there. This has been slow. We've got a few new ads. Thailand's news this last couple weeks, like, their medical program took us forever to get started with the university. It went from death penalty to like, oh, medicine, you know, and then now, like, let's get our tourism back by legalizing weed. Kind of, you know, I don't want to say ballsy, but I'm really impressed with Thailand's stance now, because they've seen that the International Narcotics Control Board, Interpol, they haven't gone after Canada, they haven't gone after Uruguay, they haven't gone after these clubs here. They're like, I think we can do this. You know, there's enough precedent that they're not going to come in and get us. I do see that, like, with China and some of the others, like from a hemp side, it's going to get a lot bigger. But you got a couple PICS countries in green there as well. And I mean, we tried to deal with Sri Lanka on like their medical program, but very, very, very challenging to do business in a few of these places. So watch what's happening in Thailand here this next couple of weeks. Australia's medical program's getting a little bit better. It's been slow. A lot of money and investment's been put into that hasn't actually yielded giant returns yet. Patients are getting medicine, but just based on their cost of production, they're not exporting all over the world yet either. It's kind of like Israel, Australia. We've made some big medical plays that just aren't happening yet. But something that's super sexy about Australia, and back to Brexit, is that by the UK not having to give up all of their Commonwealth territories, the amount of shit they're going to be able to do in these other countries for their industry, even with like Isle of Man and Gibraltar and, I don't know, I've built greenhouses in a couple of those other islands I can't remember right there in the channel, but yeah, Jersey, Guernsey, all of those are like so valuable for the UK kind of play, but it's not going to really be impactful with the European Union side. Gracias. So just the last couple things about raising capital. It's hard as hell to raise money. Everyone that's in a business, if you're not raising money, you're making money, or you're not a company. You got a couple options. So as a cannabis company, in the United States, we're federally illegal. Internationally, we're still sometimes like heroin. You gotta like not just be like cannabis and we're gonna like make a ton of money and we're gonna replace alcohol or the next big pharma or some big stories. You have to put very good models together, very good data rooms, and actually show and prove to investors like why you're a good investment thesis. That did not format well, but like when I think about impact analysis, like what are the things that are happening? These are the most important triggers for me internally as of this morning. Of all the companies that are trying to do this, they're talking to the wrong money. They don't know how to raise money. They think they're worth $1 billion, but they haven't done $1 in revenue. There's no way of setting themselves apart from the competition or securing intellectual property. They haven't done a single sale yet. Like there's nothing happening. So if you do want to raise and need to raise capital, like what kind of company are you? What kind of investors are going to invest into you? How much money do you need? How are you going to use it? What's in it for me? Like what am I going to get back as an investor? Like you have to show that. Like we don't just invest into nonprofits. Like you have to show traction and prove your story to your investors. And at this stage, it's hard. If you think you're doing fine now and don't need to raise more money, you're fucking wrong. Like it's scale, 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 scale. It's take positions, it's grow right now. That's what investors want to hear. So start early in your capital raising processes. If you have an idea or a company, start to look for experts to help build those business plans, understand the financials. Don't just tell an investor, I need $5 million to do this. And I say, how are you going to use it? And they're like, well, we're putting together a budget. I'm like, don't ask until you know. And you got to know and be able to defend your numbers. There's all the other ancillary things. It's not just cannabis companies that are super valuable, so you don't have to worry about that. Like the real estate, the packaging, the intellectual properties, the APIs, the equipment, the financing of the equipment, financing of inventory, the lawyers. There's so much opportunity here for us all. The IP side, if you don't protect your IP as an investment company, don't tell us you have IP unless it's bona fide protected, and you should do this internationally and domestic. And if you think back to just in closing here, world's changing fast. We need to do things fast and quick and right, and it's this industry, we cannot afford more mistakes to look bad. Like North Macedonian imports going to Poland, somehow finding their way into Germany. Like those games don't work anymore. Like we have to take responsibilities to this industry and do this well because it's happening so fast. And when you think about how fast it is happening, I always pull this up, we always talk about this, like think about that map in the beginning. There's little positions or like licenses, import, export. Once you start to control distribution on things, you own the chain for life. That's why Seagrams, that's why British American Tobacco, that's why they all did what they did there. It's the same thing for cannabis companies. You got once in a state or once in a country to like be in. If it's too early and not right, it makes sense not to. But we only have about 3 to 5 years to really finish establishing the whole board. And it's only going to happen with capital, new companies, and helping to change those regulations. But we have to set a higher standard for ourselves, like professionally, as an industry, and what's the importance of this plan. It's not just about the money. That's what like telling the story is important, but we're literally changing the fucking world with a plan that all of us should be in jail for like dealing with. And a lot of our friends are and were in the past. So when you join this track and like you're doing something bigger than yourself, and it's important, and what you do matters, even if you are a cannabis marketing firm, all the way down to like a custodian cleaning a greenhouse, or like the big executives like on the Toronto Exchange, it doesn't matter. But we're all a part of this. The US alone, almost 500,000 jobs reported. So we got big changes and a long way to go, and we've barely gotten started internationally. And por fin España va a cambiar mucha cosa, pero ojalá paso a paso, pero sigan hablando con las leyes, tratando de cambiar eso, porque el mundo lo necesita cáñamo y también marihuana que viene de España. Pero así, muchas gracias a ustedes y por la oportunidad.
Nic Easley, one more time. Let's hear it for Nic. Always very informative. Always fantastic.